at 75, life is supposed to be a time of calm reflection, an era where you look back with pride at the family you built, the career you navigated, and the love you nurtured. Yet, here I am, sitting in the quiet of my own home, feeling like a stranger in my own life. I often stare into the space where Sarah, my wife of 30 years, should be. I imagine her there, laughing or humming as she once did, but now there's only silence. It's as if the essence of our marriage has faded away, leaving behind an empty shell of what once was. We've been together for decades, and Sarah is still as beautiful as she was the day I met her. She's 45 now, but her spirit is that of a woman half her age. I used to think that working hard and providing for her was enough to keep the flame alive, that if I made enough money, she'd always be there, glowing with the love that had first brought us together. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what truly mattered. I lost sight of her, and maybe, in doing so, I lost myself. A house, once filled with laughter and late-night talks, now feels like a mausoleum for the love we once shared. I remember a time when Sarah and I would stay up talking about anything and everything. We'd share dreams, laugh at silly things, and hold each other close, as if afraid the other would disappear. Now, when I look at her, I see someone I hardly recognize. She's distant, her eyes reflecting a sadness I can't seem to reach or soothe. And I can't help but wonder if she sees the same in me. The alienation didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, a thief in the night, stealing away the small moments that held us together. I'd always been a hardworking man, dedicated to my career. I thought I was doing it for us, for our future. But each late night at the office, each business trip, took me further away from her. I justified it by telling myself that this was what love looked like, a willingness to sacrifice. But now, I wonder if I was just hiding, avoiding the truth that our connection was slipping away. Sarah, in her quiet way, tried to reach out to me. She'd prepare dinner, light candles, wear that dress I loved so much. She'd look at me with those eyes that once made my heart race, as if asking, "Are you still there?" I'd see the hope in her face, but I was always too tired, too preoccupied with other things to respond. I'd tell myself I'd make it up to her, but as the days turned into years, those promises became hollow. Now, when she looks at me, that hope has turned into resignation, as if she's already made peace with the fact that I'm no longer the man she fell in love with. I know she's hurting, and I know I'm the cause. I see it in the way she moves around the house, a ghost of the woman she once was. She's still here, but it's as if her spirit has already left. And I don't blame her. How could I? I took her for granted, believing that as long as I was here, physically present, that was enough. But love isn't just about being there. It's about truly seeing the other person, acknowledging their pain, their joy, their dreams. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing Sarah. The feeling of alienation has become a constant companion, a weight that sits heavy on my chest. I wake up in the morning, go through the motions, but it all feels empty. The things that once brought me joy no longer hold the same meaning. I find myself avoiding our shared spaces, retreating into my own world, because facing Sarah means facing the reality of what we've lost. I sit in my study, pretending to work, but really, I'm just hiding. Hiding from her, from myself, from the truth. I miss her. I miss us. I miss the man I used to be, the man who was capable of loving her the way she deserved. I see glimpses of him in old photographs, smiling and full of hope, and I wonder if he's gone forever. I wonder if there's a way back, or if I'm destined to live out my days in this purgatory of my own making. Sometimes, I want to reach out, to tell her how sorry I am, to beg for another chance. But I'm afraid that it's too late, that the damage has already been done. Each night, I lie awake, replaying the moments that brought us here. I think about the choices I made, the words I didn't say, the love I withheld. I try to remember the last time we held each other, the last time we laughed together, but those memories are hazy, like dreams that fade upon waking. And the more I search for them, the more I realize that they are slipping away, just like Sarah. I wish I could go back, rewrite our story, change the ending. But life doesn't work that way. All I have is the present, this empty house, and the ghost of the woman I once loved. I used to think that love was something you could hold on to, something that would always be there, no matter what. But now, I see that love is fragile, a flame that needs tending, or it will burn out, leaving only ashes behind. I look at Sarah and wonder if she feels the same, if she, too, is haunted by the ghosts of what we once had. I want to ask her, to break the silence that has settled between us, but I'm afraid of what she might say. I'm afraid that she'll confirm my worst fears, that she's already given up, that she's already gone, even though she's still here. And so, I stay silent, trapped in this prison of my own making, longing for a love that I fear is already lost. The days pass in a blur, each one blending into the next, a never-ending cycle of loneliness and regret. I find myself wondering what the future holds, if there's any hope left, or if I'm destined to live out my days as a stranger in my own life. I used to believe in forever, in happily ever after, but now, I'm not so sure. I see the way Sarah looks at me, the way her eyes reflect the same emptiness I feel, and I know that something has to change. But I don't know if I have the strength to face it, to confront the truth of what we've become. As I sit here, lost in my thoughts, I realize that the feeling of alienation isn't just about Sarah. It's about me, about the man I've become, the man who let his marriage slip away. I thought I was strong, that I could handle anything life threw at me, but now, I see that I was wrong. Love isn't something you can take for granted. It's something you have to fight for, every day, in 1,000 small ways. And somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting. I gave up, and now, I'm paying the price. I don't know what the future holds, or if there's any hope left for Sarah and me. But I know that I can't keep living like this, trapped in a prison of my own making. I have to find a way back, to break through the silence, to reach her before it's too late. I have to find the strength to face the truth, to confront the man I've become, and to fight for the love that I once thought would last forever. Because if I don't, I know that I'll lose her for good, and that's a reality I can't bear to face. Jason was always the golden boy of the family. At 53, he was the kind of man people naturally liked, charming, confident, and easygoing. He had recently returned to civilian life after serving in the U.S. Marine Corps. I had always admired him, and he had been through more than most people, yet he wore his experiences lightly, as if they were just another layer of the stories he carried. Now, after years of separation due to his military commitments, he was staying with Sarah and me in our Los Angeles home, helping out around the house while he figured out his next steps. I won't deny that having Jason here was a comfort. At my age, any help was appreciated, and he was particularly good at lifting some of the weight off my shoulders. He'd do the heavy lifting, fix things around the house, and even took care of little errands I couldn't always get to. He'd joke around, lightening the mood in a way I had long forgotten was possible. And I was grateful. I really was. But lately, something else had started creeping in, an annoying feeling I couldn't quite identify or shake. For as long as I can remember, Jason had been my best friend, my confidant, my closest ally. When our parents passed away, he was there by my side, guiding me through the grief, just as I had guided him. Our bond was unbreakable, or so I thought. That's why it felt wrong, almost like a betrayal of our brotherhood, to even consider that he might be the source of this strange feeling that had settled into my bones. The trouble started in subtle ways. I'd come home to find him and Sarah laughing in the kitchen, their heads close together over some shared joke. Or I'd walk in on them discussing a movie they'd watched while I was working late. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sarah had been lonely, and I couldn't blame her for seeking some companionship. Besides, Jason had a knack for making people feel at ease. That's why he was so good at what he did. He could talk to anyone, charm them, make them laugh. It was one of the things I admired most about him. But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Sarah seemed to light up around him in a way I hadn't seen in years. She'd laugh at his jokes, touch his arm, and look at him with a warmth that I hadn't felt from her in a long time. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, Jason was my brother. He would never do anything to hurt me. I told myself that they were just getting along, that maybe I was reading too much into it. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. I walked into the living room to find Jason and Sarah sitting close together on the couch, their heads bent over a photo album. They were laughing, reminiscing about old times. When they saw me, Sarah's smile faltered, and she quickly put some distance between them. Jason, on the other hand, gave me that easy grin of his, as if nothing were amiss. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had interrupted something, that there was an unspoken connection between them that went beyond mere friendship. I wanted to confront Jason, to ask him what was going on, but I didn't know how to begin. What would I even say? "I'm sorry, brother, but I can't help but feel uneasy when I see you with my wife?" It sounded absurd, even to me. I couldn't accuse him of anything because, as far as I could tell, there was nothing to accuse him of. He had been nothing but helpful and supportive, always ready with a smile and a joke. And yet, there was something about the way he looked at Sarah that I couldn't ignore. The worst part was that I didn't know if I was imagining things. Maybe I was just jealous, resentful of the fact that he could make her laugh in a way I no longer could. Maybe I was projecting my own insecurities onto him, blaming him for my failures as a husband. After all, it wasn't his fault that I had grown distant, that I had let the spark between Sarah and me fade. But every time I saw them together, I felt like an outsider in my own home, as if I were the intruder, the one who didn't belong. I started paying closer attention to their interactions, watching for signs that might confirm my suspicions. I'd noticed the way Sarah would fix her hair when he walked into the room, the way she'd laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, the way she'd glance at him when she thought I wasn't looking. And Jason, for his part, seemed to be more attentive to her than he needed to be. He'd pull out her chair, pour her wine, even help her in the kitchen, something I hadn't seen him do since he arrived. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that this was just a symptom of the alienation I'd been feeling, that I was projecting my insecurities onto them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if there was an invisible thread between them, something that connected them in a way I couldn't understand or reach. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me, eating away at whatever was left of my peace of mind. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, straining to hear any whisper, any movement that might confirm my fears. I felt like a fool, but I couldn't help myself. The thought of losing Sarah to my own brother was more than I could bear, and yet, the possibility seemed all too real. I knew I needed to talk to her, to ask her what was going on, but I was too afraid of what she might say. I was terrified that she would confirm my suspicions, that she would tell me that she had found in Jason what she could no longer find in me. And so, I said nothing. I kept my doubts and fears locked inside, hoping that they would go away on their own. But they didn't. They only grew stronger, like a storm gathering on the horizon, threatening to tear everything apart. I didn't know how much longer I could live like this, caught between love and suspicion, between loyalty and betrayal. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss, with no idea how to pull myself back. Every time I saw them together, laughing, talking, sharing little moments that should have been mine, I felt a wave of anger and resentment rise within me. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But I knew that if I did, there would be no going back. I would be opening a door that could never be closed, unleashing a torrent of emotions that I wasn't sure I could control. In those quiet moments, alone in the dark, I wondered if I was losing my mind. I questioned everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about trust. I wondered if I had been blind all along, if I had missed the signs that were right in front of me. And I wondered if I was strong enough to face the truth, whatever it might be. For now, I decided to wait, to watch, to see what unfolded. But I knew that I couldn't wait forever. Sooner or later, I would have to confront my fears, to face the reality of what was happening in my own home. And when that moment came, I prayed that I would have the strength to handle it, that I would be able to hold on to whatever was left of my dignity and my sanity. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world. And I knew that if I didn't find a way to bridge the gap between us, I would lose them both forever. But the question remained, could I find the courage to face the truth, or would I let my fears and doubts consume me, leaving me stranded in a world of my own making? I had always been proud of my ability to compartmentalize, to keep work separate from home life, to focus on providing without getting swept up in the emotional undertow. But somewhere along the way, that separation became a barrier, a wall I didn't see being built until it was too high to climb. For Sarah, though, the wall was never invisible. She had tried to tell me, in her own way, through the small things she did. She was always trying to bridge the gap, to reach across the divide I had unknowingly created. But every time she tried, I was too worn out, too absorbed in my own world to notice. The signs of her emotional longing were everywhere, and now that I look back, I see them with a painful clarity. It's like when you buy a new car and suddenly notice how many others like it are on the road. I'd missed so many signs, so many small moments that were Sarah's way of telling me she needed more from me. I'd grown blind to her needs, assuming that as long as I was here, physically present, that was enough. But it wasn't. She needed connection, intimacy, affection, things I hadn't given her in years. I still remember one evening when she had gone out of her way to make a special dinner. She'd cooked my favorite meal, dressed in that little blue dress I'd once loved on her, with her hair done up just the way I liked it. She was trying to recreate a time when things were simpler, when we used to spend hours just talking over a bottle of wine, savoring each other's company. But that night, I came home late, too tired to even notice the effort she had put in. I barely looked at her, let alone acknowledge the dinner she had made. I just ate in silence, my mind elsewhere, and when I was done, I went straight to bed. She didn't say a word, but her disappointment hung heavy in the air. It's moments like that that haunt me now that I see them for what they were. Sarah was trying to tell me she was still here, that she still wanted me, needed me. But I was too blind to see it, too lost in my own exhaustion to recognize her silent pleas. And as I withdrew further, it was Jason who stepped into the void I had left. He was there when I wasn't, filling the spaces I had vacated, bringing laughter and light into a home that I had darkened with my absence. I knew she was lonely. I could see it in the way she moved around the house, like a ghost haunting the memories of our former life. She still did all the little things she had always done, making sure my shirts were ironed, that my lunch was packed, that the house was clean. But it was different now. It was as if she were going through the motions, fulfilling a role that no longer held meaning for her. And I knew that I was to blame. I had taken her for granted, assuming that she would always be there, that our life together was as solid as the house we lived in. I never stopped to consider that love, like anything else, needs nurturing, needs attention. I never stopped to think that she might feel just as lost as I did. I began to notice the little ways she tried to reconnect. She'd suggest going out for dinner, or ask if I wanted to go for a walk with her, just the two of us. I always had an excuse: work, tiredness, something that seemed more important at the time. And each time I turned her down, I saw a little more of the light go out of her eyes. I told myself that there would be time later, that I'd make it up to her eventually. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers when you're not paying attention. Now, all those missed opportunities feel like weights around my neck, pulling me down into a pit of regret and guilt. Sometimes I catch her looking at Jason with a softness in her eyes that she hasn't shown me in years. It's like watching a stranger inhabit the body of the woman I love. She laughs more when he's around, her eyes lighting up in a way that I thought was lost forever. I used to be the one who could make her laugh like that, who could bring out the sparkle in her eyes. But now, it's Jason who brings that out in her, who fills the spaces I've left empty. And the worst part is, I don't even blame him. He's only being himself, doing what comes naturally to him. It's me who failed, me who let her slip away. I lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it all went wrong. I replay our life together, looking for the moment when I lost her, when she became a stranger to me. I want to reach out to her, to tell her that I still love her, that I want to find our way back to each other. But I'm afraid that it's too late, that the distance between us is too great, that she has already moved on in her heart, even if she's still here physically. The thought of losing her terrifies me, but I don't know how to fix what's broken. I don't even know where to start. Every time I try to talk to her, the words get stuck in my throat, as if they are afraid of being spoken. I want to tell her that I see her, that I know I've been absent, that I know I've hurt her. But I'm afraid of what she might say. I'm afraid that she'll confirm my worst fears, that she'll tell me that it's over, that she doesn't love me anymore. In those quiet moments, when the house is silent and all I can hear is the sound of my own breathing, I wonder if there's still a chance for us. I wonder if there's still a way to bridge the gap between us, to tear down the wall I've built. But the fear holds me back, paralyzes me. I don't know if I have the strength to face the truth, to confront the possibility that I might have already lost her. I've spent so much time building a life for us, but in the process, I lost sight of the most important thing, our love. I thought that providing for her, giving her a comfortable life, was enough. But now I see that it wasn't. I see that she needed more, that she needed me, in ways I never understood. And I wonder if I'll ever be able to give her what she needs, if I'll ever be able to be the man she once fell in love with. The pain of watching her drift away, of seeing her find solace in my brother's presence, is almost too much to bear. I feel like I'm losing her piece by piece, like sand slipping through my fingers. And the more I try to hold on, the more I feel her slipping away. It's like trying to catch a shadow, something that's there but not there, something that you can't quite grasp. I want to tell her that I'm sorry, that I know I've been blind, that I know I've taken her for granted. I want to beg her to give me another chance, to let me prove that I can still be the man she needs. But the words never come. I stay silent, trapped in my own fear and regret, watching as the woman I love slips further and further away from me. And so, I continue to live in this half-life, this limbo of my own making, haunted by the ghosts of what we once had and the shadows of what might have been. I don't know how much longer I can go on like this, pretending that everything is fine, pretending that I don't see the way she looks at Jason, the way she laughs when he's around. I don't know how much longer I can live with the knowledge that I might have already lost her, that I might have let the best thing in my life slip away without even realizing it. I always thought you could trust your own instincts. But when those instincts started telling me things I didn't want to hear, I tried to silence them. It felt absurd to believe that anything was amiss between Sarah and Jason. He was my brother. She was my wife. These were the two people I trusted most in the world. And yet, that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It began as fleeting moments, tiny signs that were barely perceptible, but they clawed at me all the same. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Sarah. I was thinking about the smile she used to have when she'd see me walk through the door after a long day. But when I walked in, she wasn't alone. There they were, sitting close together on the couch, their heads almost touching as they looked at a photo album. I stopped in the doorway, unnoticed, and watched them. Sarah was laughing, her eyes bright, her face full of an expression I hadn't seen in years. It took me a moment to realize she was looking at Jason that way. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as if by not moving, I could somehow erase the moment, make it so it hadn't happened. But I couldn't ignore it. I felt like a trespasser in my own home, peering into a scene that I wasn't supposed to witness. When Jason finally looked up and saw me, he gave me a quick nod, a smile that was too casual, too easy. Sarah's smile faded, and she closed the album as if she were closing a door between us. I turned away before they could speak to me, pretending I hadn't noticed anything at all. But inside, I felt something crack. The following days passed in a blur, but that scene replayed in my mind over and over. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But then I'd catch them again, quick glances exchanged, small touches that seemed more than just friendly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right under my nose, something that I was the last to know about. One Saturday morning, I found them in the kitchen, making breakfast together. I stood in the hallway, watching as they moved around each other, laughing, joking, their movements almost synchronized. It was like watching a dance, one that they had practiced 1,000 times, one that I hadn't been invited to. Jason reached over and brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face, his fingers lingering for just a moment too long. I felt a surge of jealousy, a feeling so intense that it almost took my breath away. I wanted to walk in, to break whatever spell they were under, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt like a ghost, watching from the sidelines as they shared something that was supposed to be mine. After that, I started avoiding them. I'd leave the house early, stay out late, finding any excuse to be away. I didn't want to see them together, didn't want to watch as they grew closer, sharing moments that should have been reserved for me. I felt like I was being edged out of my own life, slowly, quietly, as if I were being erased. I'd sit in my car, parked a few blocks away, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to gather the courage to go back inside, but each time, I felt weaker, more afraid. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I was a stranger, even to me. One evening, I tried to confront Sarah. We were sitting in the living room, the silence between us stretching like a chasm. I cleared my throat, trying to find the words, but they wouldn't come. Finally, I asked her if she thought Jason had changed, if she'd noticed anything different about him. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing, as if she were trying to read my mind. "He's just your brother," she said, her voice steady but distant. "He's here to help, that's all." "Why are you asking?" I wanted to tell her that I felt like I was losing her, like I was watching our life slip away, but the words caught in my throat, choking me. I just nodded, forcing a smile that felt like a mask, and said nothing more. After that night, I stopped trying to talk to her. I started keeping my distance, afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd shatter what little was left of our life together. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss, and all I could do was watch as the ground crumbled beneath my feet. I wanted to scream, to break the silence that was suffocating me, but I stayed quiet, holding it all inside, letting it fester, letting it eat away at me. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, a cage built from my own fears and doubts. There were nights when I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathing, wondering if she was thinking of him. I'd reach out, trying to close the distance between us, but she'd turn away, leaving me alone in the darkness. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of my own insecurities. I wanted to tell her that I still loved her, that I wanted to find our way back to each other, but the words felt hollow, empty, like they belonged to someone else. One evening, I came home to find them in the garden, planting flowers together. They were laughing, their hands dirty with soil, their faces bright with a happiness that felt foreign to me. I stood at the window, watching them, feeling like an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of their world. I wanted to go out there, to remind them that I was still here, that I was still a part of this life. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, feeling the weight of my own absence, feeling like I had already lost everything. I knew that I couldn't go on like this, that sooner or later, I'd have to confront them, to demand the truth, to make them tell me what was really going on. But I was afraid of what they might say, afraid of finding out that my worst fears were true. I was afraid of losing everything, of discovering that the life I had known was gone, replaced by a reality I couldn't face. The days blurred into nights, and I felt like I was slipping away, disappearing into a silence that I couldn't escape. I wanted to break free, to shatter the walls that had closed in around me, but I didn't know how. I felt like I was caught in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from, one that was slowly consuming me from the inside out. And so I waited, trapped in my own doubts, my own fears, watching as the world moved on without me. I knew that I was running out of time, that if I didn't do something soon, I would lose her forever. But I was paralyzed, caught between love and suspicion, between loyalty and betrayal, unable to move, unable to breathe. One night, as I stood outside their bedroom door, listening to the soft murmur of their voices, I realized that the only way forward was to face the truth. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, knowing that once I opened that door, there would be no going back. But I was ready. I was ready to find out if I still had a place in Sarah's life, or if I had been replaced by my own brother. And as I reached for the door, I knew that I was about to embark on a journey that would change everything, a journey that would either destroy me or set me free. I thought that if I worked harder, if I poured more of myself into providing for us, maybe I could close the widening gap between Sarah and me. But each day that I came home late, worn out and empty, I felt the distance between us grow. She had stopped waiting up for me. The dinners she once lovingly prepared now sat cold on the table or were stashed away in the fridge, untouched. And the few times we did eat together, the silence between us was so thick, it felt like another person at the table, sitting there and mocking the distance we couldn't bridge. I tried to pretend that everything was fine. I'd talk about my day, ask her about hers, but our conversations felt hollow, perfunctory, like we were going through the motions of being married without any of the intimacy that had once bound us together. I could feel her pulling away, slipping further and further into a world that no longer included me. And I couldn't blame her. How could I? I was the one who had let her down, who had failed to be the man she needed. The truth was, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to bridge the chasm that had opened up between us. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time we'd laughed together, the last time we'd shared a moment that felt real, that wasn't tinged with the bitterness of unmet expectations and broken promises. But those memories felt distant, like something that belonged to another life, to another man. I didn't know that man anymore. He was a stranger to me, someone I'd left behind without even realizing it. I started to feel like a guest in my own home, like someone who didn't belong. I'd walk through the rooms, seeing the traces of our life together, photographs on the wall, little knickknacks we'd collected over the years, souvenirs from vacations that now felt like distant dreams. But they were just things, empty symbols of a love that I could no longer feel, a love that had been replaced by a cold, hollow ache. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I was sorry, that I knew I'd let her down, but the words wouldn't come. I was too tired, too worn out from years of pretending that everything was fine. I felt like I was living a lie, like I was putting on a mask each day, trying to convince myself and everyone else that I was still the man I used to be. But I wasn't. I was a shadow of that man, a hollow shell, empty and drained. One night, I came home and found her sitting in the dark, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the television. She was watching one of those old romantic movies she loved, the kind we used to watch together, back when we still believed in happily ever after. I stood in the doorway, watching her, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, a sadness so deep that it threatened to pull me under. I wanted to go to her, to hold her, to tell her that I was still here, that I still loved her, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching, feeling the weight of all the things I hadn't said, all the things I hadn't done. Finally, she looked up and saw me standing there. For a moment, her eyes met mine, and I thought I saw a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe longing, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She turned back to the television, her expression unreadable, and I knew that the moment had passed, that whatever chance we might have had to bridge the gap between us was gone. I went to bed that night feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I lay there, listening to the silence, feeling the emptiness settle over me like a shroud. I knew that I couldn't go on like this, that something had to change, but I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to reach her, how to bring back the woman I had loved, the woman who had once loved me. The days dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. I started to lose track of time, losing myself in the monotony of work, using it as an escape, a way to avoid facing the reality of what my life had become. I'd leave the house before dawn and return after dark, grateful for the exhaustion that kept me from thinking, from feeling. I told myself that I was doing it for her, for us, but I knew that wasn't true. I was running, hiding from the truth that I was too afraid to face. One evening, as I sat in my car, parked outside our house, I felt a sudden wave of anger wash over me. I was angry at myself, at Sarah, at Jason, at the life that had slipped through my fingers. I wanted to shout, to scream, to break something, anything, just to feel something other than this endless, suffocating emptiness. But instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my chest tight with rage and despair. When I finally went inside, the house was quiet, empty, like a tomb. I walked through the rooms, feeling like a ghost, like someone who didn't belong. I passed by the photographs on the wall, the smiling faces of a family that no longer existed, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, a sadness so deep that it threatened to swallow me whole. I knew then that I couldn't go on like this, that something had to change. But I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to find my way back to the life I had lost, to the love that had slipped through my fingers. I was caught in a web of my own making, a prison of my own design, and I didn't know how to break free. So I stayed silent, trapped in my own doubts, my own fears, watching as the world moved on without me. I was a man adrift, lost in a sea of regrets, and I didn't know if I would ever find my way back to shore. It was one of those days at work where things didn't add up, and I found myself leaving early, my mind still spinning with numbers and figures. But as I drove, I thought of Sarah and decided to surprise her. I picked up a bottle of wine, something nice, something that might bring back a sense of normalcy, maybe even a moment of connection that I hadn't felt in a long time. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Jason's truck there, parked a little too close to the house. I hadn't expected him at this time, and for some reason, it set my heart racing. I didn't think much of it at first, though, reasoning that maybe he'd just stopped by for a quick chat. Still, it struck me as unusual, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I grabbed the wine, hoping that tonight might be different, hoping that somehow, we could find a way back to each other. As I stepped into the house, I was immediately hit by the sound of music. It was louder than usual, something upbeat and lively, the kind of music Sarah used to play when she was in high spirits. The sounds threw me off, I hadn't heard her play music like that in months. I walked through the house, feeling almost like a stranger in my own home, the wine bottle tucked under my arm like a peace offering. When I reached the living room, I found them on the couch. They were sitting closer than I expected, an empty bottle of wine on the table between them. Sarah's face was flushed, her laughter warm and relaxed, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard in so long. Jason was right there beside her, leaning in with a familiarity that made my stomach twist. The second she saw me, her laughter stopped. She looked at me, surprise flashing across her face, and I knew immediately that I had interrupted something. Jason looked up, his easy grin fading as he saw me. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual, but his tone was tense. "Didn't expect you home so early." "I finished up sooner than I thought," I replied, holding up the wine bottle in an awkward gesture. "Thought I'd bring something for us to share." I didn't know what else to say. I felt like an intruder, standing there with my own bottle of wine, as if I were a guest who'd shown up uninvited. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, and Sarah looked away, her face tightening as she started collecting the empty glasses. I could tell she was avoiding my eyes, her movements stiff, too quick, as though she needed something, anything, to do with her hands. "Why don't we all sit down?" I suggested, struggling to keep my voice steady. I didn't want them to see how thrown off I felt, how deeply unsettled. Jason nodded, his smile forced, and he reached for the wine glasses, but there was a tension in the air, a tension that was impossible to ignore. I poured the wine, trying to keep my hands steady, and we toasted awkwardly, pretending that everything was fine. But as we clinked glasses, I caught a glimpse of something in Sarah's eyes, something that I couldn't quite read. She quickly looked away, taking a long sip, and I realized that this wasn't going to be the night I'd hoped for. We made small talk, the kind of idle conversation that fills space without meaning anything. I tried to bring up familiar topics, old stories, shared memories, but everything felt forced, hollow. I watched the way Sarah glanced at Jason when she thought I wasn't looking, the way Jason shifted in his seat, avoiding my eyes. It was like they were actors in a play, pretending that everything was normal, but I could see through it. I could see the cracks. When Jason finally stood to leave, he gave me a tight smile, clapping me on the shoulder with too much force, as if he were trying to reassure me, or himself. "Good seeing you, man," he said, but there was an edge to his voice, something that felt like guilt. I tried to respond, to smile back, but my face felt frozen, my chest heavy. After he left, I turned to Sarah, hoping that we might talk, that she might give me some kind of explanation, but she just looked away, her expression closed off, her arms crossed defensively. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I felt like there was a wall between us, a wall that I didn't know how to break through. I sat down beside her, the silence stretching out like an ocean between us. I wanted to ask her what was going on, to make her tell me what I already feared, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I asked, I'd be tearing open something that couldn't be fixed. So, I just sat there, watching as she stared at the empty glass in her hand, her face unreadable. After a few minutes, she stood up, muttering something about cleaning up, and she left me there, alone with my thoughts, the wine bottle still half full on the table. I poured myself another glass, sipping it slowly, trying to process what I had just seen, what I had just felt. The wine was supposed to bring us closer, but all it had done was highlight how far apart we really were. I went to bed that night feeling more alone than ever, lying beside a woman who felt like a stranger, who I no longer knew how to reach. I stared at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in around me, and I knew that I couldn't go on like this. I knew that I had to face whatever was happening, that I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. But in that moment, I felt paralyzed, caught between the life I wanted and the reality I couldn't face. The next morning, I left the house before dawn, driving aimlessly through empty streets, trying to make sense of everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something precious, something that I would never get back. And as I drove, the sun rising slowly over the horizon, I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, a sadness so deep that I thought it might swallow me whole. I knew that things couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know how to change them. I didn't know how to get back to a place where I felt like I belonged. So, I kept driving, trying to outrun the truth, knowing that sooner or later, I would have to face it. But for now, I just drove, letting the road take me where it would, hoping that somehow, I might find a way to piece my life back together, even as I felt it slipping through my fingers. That night, I lay awake, the silence around me thick and suffocating. My mind was a storm of thoughts, replaying every look, every touch, every small interaction between Sarah and Jason. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that it was nothing, but the doubts were relentless. They dug in, rooting themselves deep, refusing to let go. I turned to look at Sarah, her face soft and untroubled in the dim light. She looked peaceful, almost content. I wanted to reach over, to touch her, to shake her awake and make her tell me the truth. But fear held me back, as if knowing the answer might break me in ways I couldn't yet understand. The morning light felt harsh and exposing, like it was stripping away every illusion I had clung to. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, couldn't keep brushing this off as paranoia. But the thought of confronting them filled me with a cold dread. What if I was right? What if everything I had built, everything I had believed in, was slipping through my fingers? As the days wore on, I found myself watching them more closely, picking up on details I might have ignored before. I saw the way Sarah's eyes would linger on Jason, the way their conversations would trail off when I entered the room. It felt like they were speaking a language I didn't understand, sharing a connection that had no place for me. I started to see the signs everywhere, in the small touches, the secret smiles, the laughter that felt like it wasn't meant for my ears. One afternoon, I decided to come home early, hoping to catch them off guard. I entered the house as quietly as I could, the familiar creaks of the floorboards now feeling strange and out of place. As I approached the kitchen, I could hear their voices, low and murmuring. I paused just outside the doorway, watching them through the narrow gap, my heart pounding. They were standing close together, their heads almost touching, as if they were sharing something private, something that had nothing to do with me. They looked so at ease, so familiar with each other, as if they belonged together in a way that I no longer did. A surge of jealousy, sharp and cold, twisted through me, leaving me breathless. I wanted to walk in, to break whatever connection they had, but I was rooted to the spot, my hands clenched at my sides. It felt like I was watching a scene from someone else's life, a life that I no longer recognized. When they finally noticed me, they pulled apart, their faces a mix of surprise and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. Sarah tried to smile, but it was thin, her eyes darting away from mine. Jason looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, as if he were trying to gauge my reaction, to see if I knew. I tried to act casual, to pretend that I hadn't seen anything, but I could feel the tension pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand, the silence around me thick and oppressive. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss, wondering what would happen if I just let myself fall. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers, to make them tell me the truth. But I was afraid. What if I was right? What if everything I had known, everything I had built, was unraveling before my eyes? In the days that followed, I found myself searching for signs, for anything that might confirm or deny what I feared. I noticed the way Sarah would touch Jason's arm, the way their laughter would die when I entered the room. It felt like I was watching my life fall apart, thread by thread, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wanted to talk to Sarah, to ask her what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. I'd sit across from her, watching her, trying to find the woman I had once known, the woman who had once looked at me like I was her whole world. But now, she felt like a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone who had slipped away without me even noticing. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until Sarah had gone to bed, and then I went into the kitchen, hoping to find something, anything, that might give me a clue. I searched through drawers, through cabinets, looking for a sign, for some piece of evidence that would either confirm or deny what I feared. But there was nothing. Just the cold, empty silence of a house that no longer felt like home, the echo of my own doubts ringing in my ears. I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, feeling like a ghost, like someone who had been left behind without realizing it. I knew that I couldn't go on like this, that I needed to confront them, to finally face the truth. But the thought of it terrified me. I felt as though I were losing my grip on reality, as if I were slipping away, sinking into a darkness that I couldn't escape. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread, a weight pressing down on me, heavy and unyielding. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this, that I needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and I prepared to confront them. I was ready to face whatever truth lay waiting for me, to finally uncover the reality of what had been hiding in the shadows for too long. As I walked into the room, ready to ask the questions that had been haunting me, I felt my heart racing, my hands shaking, but I knew that there was no turning back. I was ready to find out if I still had a place in their lives or if I had already been left behind. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work, clinging to the routine like a lifeline. I told myself that if I worked harder, if I stayed busy, I could drown out the doubts that gnawed at me. I poured myself into every task, every project, pushing through exhaustion, hoping that the relentless grind would numb the ache in my chest. But no matter how many hours I logged or how many late nights I spent at the office, the feeling lingered, shadowing me like an unwanted companion. At home, Sarah and I barely spoke. Our exchanges had become little more than habit, short phrases about groceries or bills, empty words that held none of the warmth they once had. Each time I tried to talk to her, to bridge the widening gap, the words felt hollow, falling into the silence between us like stones into a well. I found myself aching for the connection we once shared, for the days when we could talk for hours, our words flowing as naturally as breathing. but those memories seemed like they belonged to another lifetime, a version of us that had long since faded away. The distance between us felt insurmountable. I'd catch glimpses of her across the room, see her in the light of the morning, and it was like looking at a stranger. I wanted to reach out, to pull her back, but I didn't know how. There was a wall between us, one that grew taller and thicker with every passing day. And the exhaustion was constant, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. It was more than physical, it was a fatigue that seeped into my soul, leaving me empty, drained, unable to muster the energy to fight for what we'd once had. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake, listening to her breathe beside me, wondering if she felt the same sense of loss, if she too was adrift in this sea of silence. I wanted to reach out, to feel her warmth, to remind myself that she was still here, still real. But something held me back, a fear that if I touched her, she might slip away completely, leaving me alone with nothing but memories of what we'd once shared. I tried to pretend that everything was normal, but the facade was wearing thin. I began to notice that Sarah was spending more time with Jason, finding comfort in him that she no longer seemed to find in me. They would sit together, laughing, talking, sharing the kind of moments that should have been ours. I wanted to be glad for her, to feel relieved that she had someone to lean on, but all I felt was a hollow ache, a sense of loss that cut deeper with each passing day. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at an old photo of us. We were young, smiling, full of hope. I barely recognized the people in that picture, barely remembered what it felt like to be so close, so connected. It was like looking at strangers, at a version of myself that no longer existed. I wondered if we could ever find our way back to that place, if there was a path that could lead us to each other again. But as I stared at the photo, the weight of the years pressed down on me, and I realized that it might be too late. I felt a deep sense of helplessness, a knowledge that I was losing her, that I had already lost her. The silence between us had grown too vast, the wounds too raw. I wanted to fight for us, to find a way to close the distance, but I didn't know where to begin. I was lost, adrift in a world that no longer felt like my own, with no idea how to find my way back to the life we'd once shared. And so, I sat there, alone in the darkness, holding onto memories that felt as fragile as glass, hoping that somehow, against all odds, we could find our way back to each other, even as the distance between us continued to grow. In the days that followed, I found myself slipping further into an almost mechanical routine. Each morning, I would rise before dawn, trying to shake the fog that clung to me from another sleepless night. I'd leave for work early, but not because I wanted to be productive, it was just easier to be anywhere but home. The silence between Sarah and me had grown oppressive, a constant reminder of the questions that lingered unspoken, waiting for one of us to be brave enough to give them voice. At work, I was a shell of myself. I'd stare at my computer screen, my mind drifting back to that night in the kitchen, to the way Sarah and Jason had laughed together, the way she had looked at him. The scene played on a loop in my mind, each detail etched into my memory, each one more painful than the last. I tried to lose myself in tasks, in emails, in anything that could offer even a moment's distraction, but nothing worked. The doubt was always there, lurking in the corners of my thoughts, waiting to remind me of what I'd seen. One evening, I returned home to find Sarah sitting on the front steps, her arms wrapped around herself, looking out into the twilight. She seemed so small, so fragile, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to wrap my arms around her and promise that everything would be okay. But I knew I couldn't make that promise. Not now. Not when I wasn't even sure where we stood. "Hey," I said softly as I approached, feeling the weight of the silence between us. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a sadness that took my breath away. "I didn't expect you back so soon," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say, unsure if there was anything left to say. We sat in silence, the air heavy with words unspoken, with truths we were both too afraid to face. I wanted to ask her about Jason, about what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by fear, by the knowledge that once I asked the question, there would be no going back. After a long while, Sarah spoke, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "Do you ever feel like we're just going through the motions?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and painful, and I felt my chest tighten at the honesty in her voice. I swallowed, trying to find my own words, but they felt hollow, inadequate. "Yeah," I replied finally, my voice rough. "I do." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the ground, and I could see the weight of our years together pressing down on her, on both of us. I thought about all the things we had been through, all the memories we had shared, and I wondered how we had ended up here, in this place where we could barely even look at each other. For a moment, I considered reaching out, taking her hand, asking her to come inside so we could talk, really talk, for the first time in what felt like forever. But I was afraid that whatever we had once shared was gone, that there was nothing left to save. So instead, I stood up, brushing the dust from my pants, and looked down at her one last time. "I'm going to head inside," I said, the words feeling like a betrayal as they left my lips. She nodded, not looking up, and I could feel the finality of the moment settle over us like a shroud. I walked back into the house, each step feeling heavier than the last, and I knew that things would never be the same. The silence between us had grown into something vast, something insurmountable, and I wasn't sure if either of us had the strength to cross it. The days blurred together, each one feeling like a replay of the last. I wandered through the house like a ghost, watching, waiting, hoping for something, anything, that might give me clarity. The silence between Sarah and me grew heavier, thick and suffocating, like a fog that had seeped into every corner of our lives. I found myself scrutinizing the smallest details, looking for clues in fleeting glances, brief touches, and the strained quiet that hung in the air. It was as if our home had turned into a stage, and I was the lone audience, trying to decipher a play whose meaning eluded me. One evening, I came home early and found them sitting in the living room together, their heads close, speaking in hushed tones that felt too intimate, too secretive. When I walked in, they both fell silent, the way people do when they've been caught. Sarah quickly looked away, and Jason fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, pretending to be deep in thought. Our eyes met briefly, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't have solid evidence, but there was something undeniable in that glance, something that only seemed to feed my suspicions. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Is everything all right?" I asked, forcing a casual tone that sounded hollow to my own ears. I knew they could hear the tension. Jason looked at Sarah before he answered, as if waiting for her cue. "Yes, of course," he replied, but his voice was tight, strained, like he was holding back more than he could say. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her fingers gripping the edge of the magazine in her lap. I wanted to walk over to her, to put a reassuring hand on her shoulder as I used to do when she seemed worried. But something held me back, fear, maybe, that any touch could shatter the fragile illusion we were both clinging to. When Jason finally left, the silence he left behind was as loud as any confrontation. I approached Sarah, hoping to catch her eye, to find some trace of the woman I had known. But she continued to avoid my gaze, feigning interest in a speck on the coffee table. I felt like an intruder in my own home, as if someone else had taken my place while I wasn't looking. That night, lying next to her, I tried to understand how we had ended up here. She was so close, just inches away, but it felt like we were worlds apart. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, to feel her warmth. But I couldn't do it, not because I didn't want to, but because I was terrified of what might happen. I feared that if I touched her, she might pull away, and the invisible wall that had grown between us would become real, undeniable, and impenetrable. The next morning, I got up before dawn, leaving her sleeping. My mind was racing with questions that offered no rest, and each one seemed to lead to the same place, an unavoidable need to confront the situation, to finally ask the questions I'd been dreading. But every time I gathered the courage, something in me recoiled, as though I already knew the answer, and it wasn't one I wanted to hear. Each day, I came home hoping to find some explanation that would ease my doubts. I watched them carefully, picking up on every gesture, every look. It was as if they had made a pact, a silent agreement that included the two of them but left me out. They were building a world together, right in front of me, a world where I was no longer welcome. And that realization was tearing me apart from the inside out. I knew I couldn't stay in this uncertainty forever. But the truth I was afraid to uncover loomed over me like a shadow, something too terrifying to face directly. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and every passing day only strengthened my sense that eventually, I would have to take that step into the darkness. In the days that followed, I was barely present, moving through each one in a fog, as if the life around me was happening to someone else. I threw myself into work, hoping it would drown out the thoughts, but they persisted, slipping through the cracks in my focus, creeping back into my mind like shadows that wouldn't disappear. No matter how hard I tried, every quiet moment was filled with images of Sarah and Jason together. I would see them in my mind, sharing those stolen glances, the ones that lingered just a bit too long, the laughter that felt like it was meant to shut me out. I felt like I was an observer in my own life, watching from a distance as everything I had built was quietly taken from me. Every evening, I would return home to find Sarah waiting, her face softly illuminated by the dim light of the living room. She would greet me with a smile, but it was distant, a formality more than a feeling. I wanted to reach out to her, to ask what was really going on, to shatter the silence that had settled between us like an impenetrable wall. But each time, the words would get caught somewhere in my chest, and I would say nothing. The fear of what her answer might be kept me frozen, rooted in place as the distance between us grew. We began to move through our routines like strangers, exchanging only the bare minimum, simple questions about dinner, perfunctory comments about the bills. Every interaction felt hollow, as if we were playing roles we no longer believed in. I would catch glimpses of her from across the room, and it was like looking at someone I didn't recognize. The warmth that had once connected us was gone, replaced by a coldness that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. One evening, I sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey, listening to the quiet sounds of the house around me. I could hear Sarah in the other room, her footsteps a distant echo that somehow felt more isolating than comforting. I thought back to the early days, the late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours, the easy laughter, the way we would share our dreams and fears without hesitation. But those memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else, some other life I could no longer touch. I wanted to call her over, to tell her to sit down, to make her look at me and really see me, see what we were becoming. But every time I thought about it, a wave of exhaustion would wash over me, and I would let the moment pass. I didn't know where to begin. The words felt too heavy, too final, and I was afraid that once they were spoken, there would be no way back. That night, lying in bed next to her, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing, feeling the distance between us as something almost physical. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to remind her of everything we had shared, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The silence between us felt insurmountable, a chasm that had grown over the years, unnoticed until it was too wide to cross. The next morning, I left the house before dawn, walking aimlessly through the empty streets, the cold air biting at my skin, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I wandered without direction, lost in my thoughts, trying to remember the last time I had felt truly connected to my own life. The city was waking up around me, but I felt like an outsider, moving through a world that no longer felt like mine. I wondered how long I could keep pretending, how long I could keep living this half-life, caught between what was and what might never be again. When I finally returned home, the house was empty, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I could hardly bear. I stood in the living room, surrounded by the relics of our life together, the photographs, the pieces of furniture we had chosen side by side. I wanted to tear it all apart, to rid myself of everything that reminded me of what we had once had, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The life we had built was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. I sank onto the couch, feeling the ache in my chest deepen, as though a part of me were being hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but an emptiness that stretched on and on. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pretending that we were still the people we had once been. I knew that something had to change, that I had to find a way to let go, to move forward, to rebuild. but I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to say goodbye to the life we had shared, even as I felt it slipping through my fingers like sand. As I sat there in the growing light of the morning, I realized that I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a future that I couldn't see, a path that I didn't know how to follow. And I knew that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The life I had once known was gone, and there was no going back. I decided to come home early that day. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was slipping away from me, something I had no control over. As I drove, my mind raced with questions that I couldn't quite voice, even to myself. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the gnawing doubt had become too much. I had to confront it, one way or another. When I pulled into the driveway, a strange stillness seemed to hang over the house, like the air before a storm. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly, almost bracing myself before I finally stepped out of the car. Walking up the steps, I noticed a faint murmur of music coming from inside, the kind of jazz that was unfamiliar to me. I paused, listening, and then opened the door. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. There was an odd quietness laid over the soft jazz music that floated down the hallway. I followed the sound into the living room, my heartbeat picking up with each step. And then I saw them, Sarah and Jason, sitting together on the couch. They hadn't noticed me yet, they were too caught up in their conversation. Sarah's hand rested lightly on Jason's arm, and the way he was looking at her, it was like he was seeing something precious, something delicate. I stopped, standing there in the doorway, and a wave of disbelief washed over me. It felt like I was intruding on a moment I wasn't supposed to see. The air was thick, heavy, as though the room itself held its breath. When Sarah finally looked up and saw me, she quickly pulled her hand back, a flicker of guilt passing over her face. Jason shifted, his posture stiffening, and in that instant, I knew that whatever I had felt these past weeks wasn't imagined. "David," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, "I didn't expect you home so early." I forced myself to step further into the room, every movement feeling like a test of will. "I decided to take some time off," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the tension coiling in my chest. "It seems I came back at an interesting time." An uneasy silence settled between us, a silence so dense it felt like it had substance, like it was pressing down on me. Jason cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes as he stood. "I should go," he muttered, brushing past me quickly, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he left. I stood there, feeling my hands clench at my sides, my mind reeling from what I'd just seen. I turned back to Sarah, who had stayed on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. I could see the strain in her posture, the way she seemed to be holding herself together, and a part of me wanted to demand answers. But another part, the part that had been dreading this, was terrified of what she might say. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. I could feel the anger building, a slow burn that threatened to consume me, but I held it back, waiting for her response. Sarah looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. "It's not what you think," she said, but the words felt hollow, insubstantial. I wanted to believe her, to take her at her word, but the image of her with Jason, their easy familiarity, wouldn't leave my mind. "Then tell me what it is," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I felt the frustration, the betrayal, all of it building up like a storm, but I needed to hear her answer. She hesitated, her gaze dropping back to her hands. "Jason's just been, he's been here for you, David. He's just been a friend," she said, but there was a tremor in her voice, and I knew there was more she wasn't saying. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had grown between us, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I just nodded, the silence stretching between us, a chasm too wide to cross. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there, alone, wrapped in the silence that had settled over us. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away, to clear my head, to escape the weight of everything that had just happened. I wandered through the house, through rooms that were filled with memories of a life we had built together. The photographs on the walls, the pieces of furniture we had chosen side by side, they all stared back at me, silent witnesses to the life I thought I knew. I wanted to tear it all down, to erase every trace of the past, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The life we had once shared was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. As I stood there, surrounded by ghosts of a life I no longer recognized, I felt a hollowness settle in my chest, a quiet ache that seemed to echo through every part of me. I knew that nothing would ever be the same, that the future I had once imagined was gone, replaced by an uncertain path that stretched out before me, a path I didn't know how to follow. And as the weight of it all pressed down on me, I realized that I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a life I no longer knew, and a truth I could no longer ignore. After that day, everything changed. I could no longer ignore the suspicions that had taken root in my mind, suspicions that now felt like an ever-present weight, pressing down on me, filling every moment with doubt. Each time I caught Sarah and Jason together, I scrutinized their every move, every glance, searching for signs that might confirm what I feared but couldn't bring myself to say aloud. In the past, I would have brushed it off, convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. But now, after what I'd seen, those fleeting moments between them, the shared glances, the quick smiles, the way they seemed to share secrets when they thought I wasn't looking, seemed like undeniable proof that something was happening right under my nose. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but the fear of what I might hear held me back. I started paying closer attention to their interactions, noticing things I hadn't before. When Jason came over, he'd sit a little too close to her, his hand lingering on her shoulder for just a moment longer than necessary. Sarah would smile at him, a genuine smile, one that I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. It was as if they shared an unspoken language, a quiet understanding that excluded me, leaving me on the outside, looking in. One afternoon, I arrived home unexpectedly. I had left work early again, unable to focus, needing to clear my head. As I walked up the driveway, I saw them through the window, their heads close together, whispering. I paused, watching, a knot of tension forming in my stomach. They looked comfortable, familiar, like two people who had shared something deep, something intimate. I felt my hands clench at my sides, the anger and hurt simmering just below the surface, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of my suspicions crushing down on me. That night, as I lay beside Sarah, the questions churned in my mind. I wanted to ask her, to demand the truth, but every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. The silence between us felt like a chasm, growing wider with each passing day, and I didn't know how to bridge it. I could feel her drifting further away, slipping through my fingers, and the helplessness was almost unbearable. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I would catch a glimpse of something in her expression, guilt, maybe, or sadness. I couldn't tell for sure, but it was enough to make me question everything. I started searching for clues, small things that might reveal what I was too afraid to ask. I noticed that she would go out more often, leaving the house without saying where she was going. She would come back late, offering vague explanations, brushing off my questions with a casualness that only deepened my doubts. The more I looked, the more I found reasons to suspect. It was in the way she'd glance at her phone and smile, a smile that she never shared with me. It was in the way she'd avoid my eyes when I asked her how her day had been, her answers growing shorter, her tone more distant. It was in the way she seemed to light up whenever Jason was around, as if he were the one who brought life back into her eyes. One evening, I finally decided that I couldn't take it anymore. I sat across from her at the dinner table, watching as she picked at her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, and I knew that I had to say something, had to break through the walls that had grown between us. "Sarah," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "is there something you need to tell me?" She looked up, surprise flickering across her face, quickly replaced by a guarded expression. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone light, almost too casual. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I can't help but feel like there's something going on. Something you're not telling me." She frowned, setting her fork down, and for a moment, I thought she might finally open up, might finally tell me the truth. But instead, she shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "David, you're imagining things. There's nothing going on. You have to trust me." Her words stung, and I could feel my heart sink. I wanted to believe her, wanted to take her at her word, but the doubts had already taken root, and they wouldn't let go. I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending to accept her reassurance, but deep down, I knew that I was only fooling myself. The questions remained, unanswered, gnawing at me, eroding the trust that had once held us together. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence between us felt colder than ever, a reminder of the distance that now separated us. I knew that I couldn't keep going like this, that I had to find a way to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But the fear of what I might find held me back, paralyzing me, trapping me in a web of doubt and suspicion. And as the darkness pressed in around me, I realized that I was standing on the edge of something that I couldn't ignore, a truth that I couldn't escape. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The life I had once known was slipping away, leaving me alone in the silence, haunted by the ghosts of what had once been and the shadows of what I feared was yet to come. The days passed, and I found myself sinking further into a sense of loss that I couldn't shake. Even though I hadn't uncovered the full truth, the suspicion alone had already started to erode the foundation of my life with Sarah. I couldn't look at her the same way. Each time she entered the room, I felt a pang of sadness, an ache that seemed to echo deep within me. It was as if I were mourning something that wasn't quite gone yet, but already felt out of reach. We still went through the motions of our daily routines, but they felt hollow now. I could barely remember the last time we had shared a genuine moment of connection. It was as though I were looking at our life through a veil, seeing everything in muted shades, with a clarity that only highlighted the growing emptiness between us. Each morning, I'd wake up to her beside me, and each morning, I'd feel the same sinking feeling in my chest, like I was waking up to a stranger. I spent hours thinking back over our years together, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything had changed, when that distance had begun to grow between us. I searched through old memories, trying to find clues, to understand where I had gone wrong. I'd look at photos of us, smiling, happy, and feel a sense of disbelief, as though those moments belonged to another life. I couldn't reconcile the woman in those pictures with the one who now shared my home but seemed so far away. One evening, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the artifacts of our life together, the framed photos on the walls, the souvenirs from vacations, the little knickknacks we had collected over the years. They all felt like relics from a past that was slipping further from my grasp. I felt a profound sadness settle over me, the kind that weighs down on your heart, heavy and suffocating. I realized that, even though I didn't have concrete proof yet, I was already grieving the loss of something that had once been so precious to me. I tried to distract myself with work, with anything that could pull me out of my own head. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the sadness always found a way back in, creeping into the quiet moments, filling the spaces where laughter and love had once been. I felt like I was drifting, caught between the life I had known and the uncertainty of a future I didn't want to face. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of Sarah, lost in her own thoughts, and I would wonder if she felt it too, if she could feel the weight of the distance that had grown between us. But she never said anything, and I couldn't bring myself to ask. The words felt too heavy, too final, and I was afraid that speaking them aloud would only make the loss more real. The hardest part was knowing that I couldn't turn back the clock. I couldn't go back to the days when we had been happy, when we had been enough for each other. Those days were gone, and no amount of wishing could bring them back. I was left with nothing but the memories and the hollow ache of knowing that what we had built together was slipping away, piece by piece. And so, I drifted through the days, carrying the weight of a loss that hadn't yet come to pass, but felt inevitable. I knew that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't ignore, that the life I had once known was crumbling around me, and I was powerless to stop it. And in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I could feel the full weight of that loss pressing down on me, a reminder that the future I had once dreamed of was now nothing more than a fading shadow of a life I could never reclaim. It was a day like any other when everything changed. I hadn't been looking for answers, not actively, at least, but that gnawing doubt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I tried to push it aside, tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. But the questions wouldn't let go, and the sense of loss that had settled over me had become too much to ignore. That afternoon, I came home earlier than usual, hoping to catch a moment of quiet before Sarah returned. As I stepped inside, the silence of the house felt heavier than ever, like it was hiding something. I set my keys down and noticed her phone lying on the kitchen counter, its screen lighting up with a message. I hesitated, feeling a rush of guilt, but I couldn't look away. The name on the screen stopped me cold, Jason. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling as I swiped it open. I knew it was wrong, knew I was crossing a line, but something inside me wouldn't let me stop. I scrolled through the messages, each one a punch to the gut, each word tearing away another piece of the life I thought I knew. There was no mistaking the intimacy in their words, the familiarity, the warmth that had once been reserved for me. They spoke of secret meetings, of stolen moments, of feelings that should have been mine. I read each message, the reality sinking in with every line. There it was, the truth I had been afraid to confront, spelled out in front of me in stark, undeniable clarity. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me suspended in a void, unable to breathe, unable to think. I put the phone down, the weight of what I had just uncovered pressing down on me with a force I couldn't bear. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind reeling, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I thought back over the past weeks, the quiet moments, the lingering looks, the smiles that hadn't been meant for me. I had known, on some level, that this was coming, but seeing it laid out in front of me was more than I could handle. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd ever thought possible, a wound that I knew would never heal. Eventually, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. I felt numb, as though I had become disconnected from my own body, from the life I had known. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt like a prison, trapping me in a reality I didn't want to face. I wanted to scream, to break something, to let out the rage and pain that were consuming me from the inside. But all I could do was sit there, paralyzed by the weight of it all. I thought about confronting Sarah, about demanding answers, about making her look me in the eye and tell me why. But the words felt empty, meaningless, like they would only echo back at me, unanswered and unfulfilled. The truth was, there was nothing she could say that would make this right. The damage had been done, and no amount of explanations or apologies could undo what I had just discovered. In that moment, I realized that the life we had shared was truly over. The future I had once imagined, the dreams we had built together, all of it had been shattered in an instant, reduced to nothing more than a memory. I felt a cold, hollow emptiness settle in my chest, a void that I knew would never be filled. I was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss that held nothing but the remnants of a life that was no longer mine. And as I sat there, alone in the silence, I knew that I had a choice to make. I could confront her, demand answers, or I could walk away, leave behind the fragments of a life that had been built on lies. But either way, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth had been uncovered, and there was no going back. As the reality of what I had discovered settled in, a flood of emotions washed over me, hurt, betrayal, disbelief. But beneath all of it, there was an anger that I had never felt before, a raw, searing rage that seemed to ignite every nerve in my body. It started as a simmer, a low burn that built steadily, until it felt like my entire chest was on fire, ready to explode. I couldn't sit still, couldn't stay in that empty, suffocating silence. My fists clenched, my jaw tightened, and without thinking, I pushed back from the table and began pacing the room. The images from those messages were burned into my mind, looping over and over, each one fanning the flames of my anger. I felt like a fool, like I had been blind to everything happening right under my nose. How could I not have seen it sooner? How could I have let this happen? The memories of the moments I had brushed aside came rushing back, the lingering glances, the shared laughter, the way Sarah had seemed so distant, so unreachable. All of it fell into place now, each piece fitting together in a picture that I wished I could tear apart, erase from existence. But there was no undoing it, no changing what I had seen. The betrayal was real, and there was no escaping it. Before I knew it, I found myself in our bedroom, standing in front of the dresser that held so many reminders of the life we had shared. I could see photos of us together, souvenirs from trips we had taken, all of it mocking me now, like artifacts from a lie. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the framed photos, a picture of us on our honeymoon, smiling, happy, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the glass scattering across the floor like the pieces of my broken trust. The sound of the breaking glass filled the room, punctuating the silence with a violence that felt almost cathartic. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to destroy everything, to tear down every last remnant of the life that had been stolen from me. I grabbed another photo, then another, throwing them with a force that surprised even me. Each crash, each break, felt like a release, like I was finally letting out all the pain, the anger, the betrayal that had been festering inside me. But as the last frame shattered, the adrenaline began to fade, and I was left standing in the wreckage, surrounded by the broken pieces of a life that no longer existed. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, feeling the weight of everything settle over me once again. The rage that had burned so hotly only moments before was replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch on endlessly. In that moment, I realized that I had nothing left. The anger, the pain, all of it had taken everything from me, leaving me drained, numb, and alone. The life I had known, the love I had believed in, was gone, reduced to fragments and memories. And there was no bringing it back. I sat there for what felt like hours, lost in a haze of exhaustion and grief, until I finally heard the sound of the front door opening. Sarah's voice called out, a note of confusion in her tone as she walked through the house. I could hear her footsteps approaching, growing closer, until she stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene of shattered glass and broken frames. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes wide, her face pale. I looked up at her, feeling the last embers of my anger flicker back to life. "What happened?" I repeated, my voice low, barely more than a whisper. "You happened, Sarah. You and Jason and your lies. That's what happened." She took a step back, a flash of fear crossing her face, and for the first time, I saw her for what she truly was, a stranger, someone I could no longer trust, someone who had torn apart the life we had built together. I stood, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. I knew that this was it, the end of everything, the point of no return. "I can't do this anymore," I said, the words coming out with a finality that even surprised me. "You've broken everything, Sarah. There's nothing left." And with that, I walked past her, leaving her standing in the wreckage, leaving behind the fragments of a life that had once meant everything to me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away as possible, to escape the ruins of a love that had been built on lies and betrayal. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief, a freedom I hadn't expected. The rage had burned through me, leaving nothing but ashes, but in those ashes, I found the first flicker of something new, a chance to rebuild, to start over, to leave behind the pain and find a way forward, one step at a time. That evening, I waited for Sarah to come home, a knot of tension tightening in my chest with each passing minute. The house was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt thick and suffocating, filled with the weight of everything I needed to say. I'd picked up most of the broken glass from the shattered photos, but the fragments still littered the floor, glinting in the fading light like jagged pieces of our life together. When I finally heard the front door open, my heart clenched, and I stood there in the living room, bracing myself. She walked in, her face pale, her eyes immediately taking in the broken frames, the chaos, before she looked at me. I saw the flash of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something else, resignation, maybe, as if she had known this was coming but had hoped to avoid it a little longer. "David," she started, her voice soft and cautious, "what happened here?" I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head. You really have to ask? You know what this is about. I found your messages with Jason. I know everything, Sarah. Everything. My voice trembled with the weight of the words, each one a punch thrown into the silence between us. She took a step back, as if the force of my anger was something tangible, something she needed to protect herself from. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off, the bitterness in my voice spilling out before I could stop it. Why, Sarah? I need to know why you did it. Was it worth it? Was he worth it? She closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath before looking at me, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she whispered, her voice cracking. At first, I was just lonely. You've been so distant, David. Wrapped up in work, in everything but us. I felt like I didn't matter anymore. I felt her words hit me, each one a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. Part of me knew she was right, that I had been consumed by work, by the need to provide for us. But that didn't excuse what she had done. So you turned to Jason? I said, my voice laced with disbelief. My own brother? How could you do that, Sarah? How could you betray me like that? She looked away, wiping at her tears, her shoulders slumping as if under a weight too heavy to carry. I didn't plan it, David. It just happened. I know it sounds like an excuse, but it's the truth. He was there, he listened, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was wrong. I know that. But I can't undo it. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her understand the depth of the hurt she had caused. But all I could do was stand there, feeling the last threads of my patience unravel. There's no going back from this, Sarah. You've destroyed everything we built together. And for what? A few moments of comfort? She flinched, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something that looked like regret, genuine and raw. I never meant to hurt you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I understand if you can't forgive me. I don't expect you to. I stared at her, the woman I had once loved, now a stranger standing before me. Her words felt like ashes, empty and insubstantial, and I knew that nothing she could say would ever make this right. The betrayal had cut too deep, leaving a wound that would never heal. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of our life together. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, sharp and biting, but it was a relief. I felt a strange sense of freedom, a sense of finality. The life I had known was gone, shattered beyond repair, but I was free from the lies, from the weight of a love that had become nothing more than a memory. And as I walked away from the home we had built, I knew that this was the beginning of something new. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and loss, but it was mine to walk alone. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it, to leave behind the past and find a way forward, no matter how difficult it might be. The days that followed felt like a blur, a strange limbo where time seemed to stand still, yet dragged on relentlessly. I stayed in a small motel on the edge of town, far enough from everything familiar, yet close enough to be reminded of all that I had left behind. I needed the distance, the space to breathe, to think, to figure out what to do next. I spent hours in that room, the silence pressing down on me, forcing me to confront the reality I had been avoiding for too long. I replayed the confrontation with Sarah over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every moment, trying to make sense of it all. The betrayal, the hurt, the anger, it all blended together, a tangled mess that I couldn't seem to unravel. At times, the pain would swell up so intensely that I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the weight of everything would crush me if I didn't find a way out. I would pace the small room, trying to escape the thoughts that circled endlessly in my mind, but there was no escape. I was trapped, bound to the past, and I didn't know how to break free. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of cars passing on the highway, wondering where they were going, what lives they were returning to. I would think about Sarah, about the life we had built together, the memories we had shared. I missed her, despite everything, and that realization cut me deeper than I had thought possible. I missed the woman I had once loved, the life we had once shared, but I knew that those things were gone, replaced by a reality I could no longer bear to face. One morning, I woke up and realized that I couldn't stay in that room forever. I couldn't keep hiding from the world, from the decisions that needed to be made. I knew that I had to move forward, to find a way to rebuild, to create a life that was mine again, free from the shadows of betrayal and loss. But the path ahead felt uncertain, filled with questions I didn't know how to answer. I thought about Sarah, about the confrontation, about the look in her eyes when she had finally told me the truth. There had been regret there, yes, but there had also been something else, a kind of resignation, as if she knew that this was the end. And maybe it was. Maybe there was no way to salvage what we had once shared, no way to rebuild from the ashes. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the grey morning sky, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the faintest glimmer of resolve. I knew that I had a choice to make, that I could either let the past consume me or find a way to rise above it. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had been. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and for the first time, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The road ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was mine to walk. And though the pain was still there, raw and unrelenting, I knew that I had the strength to face it, to move forward, one step at a time. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worth having ever was, but I was ready. Ready to leave behind the ghosts of the past, to let go of the hurt, the anger, the betrayal. I was ready to start again, to build a life that was mine alone, a life free from lies, free from the weight of a love that had turned to ashes. And as I packed my bags and prepared to leave that motel room behind, I felt a sense of relief, a sense of possibility. The path ahead was still unclear, but it was a path I could walk alone, a path that I knew would lead me to a place where I could finally be free. As I left the motel that morning, I knew that there was one final piece of business I needed to handle. It wasn't enough to simply walk away, to let Sarah and Jason carry on as if their betrayal hadn't ripped my life apart. No, I needed closure, a way to make sense of everything that had happened, to take control of a situation that had spiraled so far out of my reach. I needed to reclaim some piece of myself, to find a way to move forward. And to do that, I knew I had to make sure they felt the consequences of their actions. I spent the next few days in quiet preparation. I knew Sarah and Jason well enough to know where they'd be and when. I collected my thoughts, planning carefully, knowing that I needed to be precise and calculated. This wasn't about violence, though I'd be lying if I said I hadn't felt that urge. No, this was about making sure they understood the full impact of what they'd done, about ensuring that they felt the weight of their choices in a way they couldn't escape. I started with the financials. Over the years, I had kept meticulous records of our assets, our savings, our investments, things Sarah hadn't paid much attention to. With a few discreet transfers and some strategic phone calls, I managed to secure our joint funds into my personal account. I knew it was harsh, but so was the betrayal. If she wanted to rebuild, she could do it without the resources we had accumulated together. She had chosen to destroy our marriage, and I would leave her to pick up the pieces alone. Next, I turned my attention to Jason. I knew enough about his recent employment to know that his position was precarious, that a word in the right ear could shift the ground beneath him. It didn't take much, a well-placed phone call, a discreet tip about his recent behaviors. I knew he was hanging by a thread, and with the information I had, that thread snapped. He'd find it hard to secure work in this city again, and I took a grim satisfaction in knowing that. The last piece was something personal, something only Sarah and I would understand. I wrote her a letter, not a letter of anger, but one that laid out, in painful detail, everything I felt. I wanted her to know the depth of the hurt, the betrayal, the impact her choices had wrought. I wanted her to read my words, to feel the weight of each one, to understand that there was no turning back. I wasn't looking for sympathy or reconciliation, I wanted closure, a way to leave it all behind. When the preparations were complete, I returned to our house one last time. I left the letter on the dining table, a final testament to the life we had shared and the life that had been lost. I looked around the empty rooms, the remnants of what had once been a home filled with laughter, love, and dreams. It felt hollow now, a shell of what it had been, and I knew that I was ready to walk away. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a sense of release, a lightness that had been missing for far too long. The revenge, small and calculated as it was, had given me a sense of control, a sense of balance. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that I was free from the weight of the past. I had reclaimed a piece of myself, and with it, the strength to begin anew. I left that day, with no intention of looking back. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was mine alone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I knew there would be scars, memories that would linger, but they would be mine to carry, and I would wear them as a reminder of the strength it took to walk away. And so, I set off, leaving behind the fragments of a life that was no longer mine, stepping into a future that, while uncertain, was finally free from the shadows of betrayal. It was a new beginning, and as I walked away, I felt the first stirrings of hope, a whisper of possibility, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, I could find peace on the other side.